Let's talk a little college football with Mike Golic Jr. joining us on the Diamond Factory Hotline, and it's all courtesy of DraftKings. Good morning, Mike. How are you?
Morning. I'm doing well. How you guys doing?
Doing well. Where are you right now? What city are you in?
So I am currently in Los Angeles. I am getting ready to board a flight to Jacksonville later today to try and watch Notre Dame and South Carolina in the Gator Bowl. So my bowl season is not yet done.
Is your flight with Southwest Airlines?
No. I gave myself that gift this holiday season and have managed to avoid that so far. But, man, anyone who is in that mix right now, I'm thinking of you because, my God, what a meat grinder.
Follow-up question. You're going to Jacksonville. What do you think about the city? As I just recently came back from there from the Cowboys game, and it was rough. I got to say, it was rough.
Yeah, you know what? Jacksonville exists.
I said it's if a pawn shop was a city.
Yeah, you know what? And interesting. And you know what? We need pawn shops. So everyone's got a purpose. Everyone's got something there. I'm excited. I wish it was. The one thing I forget about North Florida is that it can actually get cold. And so the weather forecast for this game has been less than ideal for me now because I moved from Connecticut to Los Angeles in June, and I've become very bougie when it comes to weather, and I now have certain needs that need to be met, and I don't know if Jacksonville is going to meet them.
All right, you grew up in a college and NFL household, so like just as a fan, we're going to talk college football, but as a fan, how do you divide your NFL and college love? Is it straight 50-50? Do you lean more towards college? Is it more towards NFL?
So, you know what, as a fan, like getting to watch everything, it really is. Like if football's on, then I'm watching. I joked the other night, you guys will appreciate this. Luka Doncic goes for one of the more historic performances, the first 60-20-10 game in NBA history, and I missed watching it live because I was in the middle of watching the Guaranteed Rate Bowl. I was watching Wisconsin fake a field goal on a baseball field in a game where neither quarterback had started for that team during the regular season, instead of watching Luka Doncic do the incredible thing. So, fandom-wise, it's right down the middle, really. Coverage-wise, listen, I love getting to cover college football because I didn't have the long NFL career that Dad had. I played hot college football. It was what I grew up loving, and certainly, you know, my affinity for Notre Dame is still really strong. And so coverage-wise, I love getting to dive into these college towns and go get off the beaten path a little bit. But, man, listen, I'm ready to watch somebody hit somebody if it's on TV.
All right. Does it feel like TCU is just the nice, cute little story? Sonny Dykes and the Horned Frogs, obviously a little bit ticked off that they feel like the Final Four charity case. How are you looking at TCU, whether they belonged, whether they deserve to get in, and what real chance they have against Michigan?
So here's the thing, like belong and deserve, like they're all that. Like I feel like we do this every year with the team that winds up. The team's really in the 3 and 4 spot, right?
Yeah.
Like we always look at it, and even if the result goes poorly for TCU, which it could, like they still belong and deserve that. What they did this year was incredible, managing to win that many games, especially the way they won, how close a lot of these games were, the different things it took for that team. That's really hard to do. Like, forget just the X's and O's of that mentally for that team to be able to muster that without having really had those results before. Like, it's one thing if you're a program that's been winning for years and years on end now, and you've got a bunch of time under task in close games, and you know, all right, when we get into these situations, I know how to operate. My heart rate doesn't really get up that high. They didn't have the benefit of that. This hasn't been a good team for the last few years. And so, no, they absolutely belong. They absolutely deserve this. And listen, they're built in the right ways, right? And this is one of the things we saw across college football with, head coaches in year one at new schools. When you're built with experience in the trenches, the way that TCU was, especially on the offensive side, you've got a quarterback that's played meaningful football. And then, listen, for them, Quentin Johnston's been incredible and is going to be a future first-round NFL wide receiver. I think you had a pair of really good corners on the other side defensively to go along with some big beef up front on the D-line. And, some timely use in the transfer portal for this team also. They absolutely deserve this. They absolutely belong here. Now, do I think they're going to beat Michigan? No, I'm not picking them to do so this weekend. I think they can make it close because they've made everything close and because they're built in all the ways that we talked about here. But I still think ultimately right now, Michigan's further along in the process. Michigan, kind of went through a lot of these warts and growing pains last year, and they've come back out on the other side even better in certain areas for it. So, no, TCU is not a charity case, but losing in the spot that they're in right now, being a newcomer in the college football playoff, doesn't mean you weren't supposed to be here.
TCU obviously likes to, you mentioned Quentin Johnston there, like they like to push the ball downfield. The passing game is a big part of what they do, but, how much of what we saw from Michigan at the end of the year against Ohio State with J.J. McCarthy, do you think that was an outlier, or do you think that is what they're capable of if they try to push the ball downfield? That it's like, hey, J.J. McCarthy never really had the opportunity to do this. He can do this if you ask him to.
Well, so I think it's an outlier right now, and that's one of the things I'm most curious about this game is, all right, do it again. So I called the Michigan State game this year, which before it became known for the altercation in the tunnel after the fact, I looked at as an incredible opportunity for Michigan to explore their downfield passing game against a Michigan State secondary that's been one of the worst in college football for the last 2 seasons. And I went and I kept watching and I kept looking and I kept waiting, and they kept not going downfield and it kept not happening. And I had a lot of questions about that. And so when you look at the Ohio State game, those were big plays in pressure spots, right? J.J. McCarthy getting the ball out against blitz looks, Ronnie Bell and those guys being able to make plays that turned into long touchdowns against an Ohio State team that say, hey, we're going to load up the box and we're not going to let you do this to us up front. And they were very successful in that. And so I look at that, and now for Ronnie, for Cornelius Washington, for that receiver core, going up against, Travius Hodges-Tomlinson is the one that certainly gets a lot of the press clippings, but both TCU games I covered this year, Josh Newton kept jumping off the page. Like on that other side, when he was challenged, he stepped up to the plate. But, I had Oklahoma State and Iowa State, which obviously the latter wasn't super competitive, but tons of pass breakups in that game, 2 guys that you could trust so that you can do a little bit more up front, and you can let that linebacker core and D-line play a little bit faster downhill because you trust those guys on the back end. So that's a really interesting matchup, and one that I think is going to go a long way in deciding the margin of this game, because that was a big thing for Michigan, and they're going to get back to their bread and butter. No, obviously, Blake Corum, but Donovan Edwards is an incredible back, and they've got the best offensive line in college football, the winners of the Joe Moore Award. But I think that matchup on the outside is really underrated.
See, it's that was kind of leads into the next question for me there, where you say, Michigan is going to get back to their style of ball, which is obviously, the ground game and using that great offensive line. TCU wants to make this more of a track meet, I would guess. Is it easier? Is that more of a challenge, you think, for TCU? Why is it that when teams want to get into that track meet style, it feels like it's more difficult to get into their style of game than to get into some of that blue-collar football that Michigan wants to play?
Well, listen, I think at the end of the day, you simplify the equation a little bit when you're saying, why is it easier to do that? Going downhill is the simplest form of football in general, right? It's why coaches love it so much, because they're all really risk-averse. It's easy to just run duo, hand the ball off, and then like we saw late in that game for Michigan, hey, guy busts a 70-yard run, and that's gravy because you're really just looking for 3 to 5 yards on any given play. And so I think that's just kind of a huge part of it. It's the simplest form of all this versus, when you go and try and speed things up or you're trying to go downfield, there's a little bit, slimmer margin for error. All of a sudden, everything becomes a little bit more important in that process. There can be some boom or bust to that, which TCU's had to deal with this year, and it's why they've been down in some of these games very early on and had to claw their way back in, but they're also capable of clawing their way back in because you've got a viable deep threat. You've got some other explosive options in there. You've got a quarterback who's at the college level a viable run threat and a really tough kid. So all those things can kind of lend themselves well.
DraftKings college football analyst Mike Golic Jr. here on 105.3 The Fan via the Diamond Factory hotline. How are you looking at the other game? Is this an unlucky matchup for Georgia against Ohio State?
I don't trust Ohio State enough in the places that we've had questions about them all year. Now, I will give them some credit and grace. I thought looking back at the Michigan game, JT Tuimoloau and that defensive line, I thought acquitted themselves better than they got credit for after that game. The line of scrimmage was not dominated by Michigan that day by any stretch of the imagination. on defense. On offense, it's a different story. And Ohio State all year has, we know, been known for Marvin Harrison Jr. and C.J. Stroud, and, you know, even when Travion Henderson went down, Mayan Williams and the job that he was able to do in the backfield. But that offensive line, Paris Johnson's a great player. You know, DeJuan Jones, these are names that we know and guys that will play pretty lucrative NFL football. But that's not a group that can go out there and physically beat anyone right now. We saw it against Michigan. We saw it against Northwestern. They can run with anybody, but they cannot get downhill and get bloody. And when you go back to the last Ohio State team to win meaningful games, you know, and win a national title, Ohio State in 2014 was beating people upside the head with a run game with Zeke Elliott and that offensive line. And they can't go downhill at people like that right now. And against this Georgia team that, listen, doesn't get after the quarterback incredibly well, and certainly is not last year's defense, the biggest area it impacts you is the red zone. And I think that's the biggest thing for Ohio State is if you're not going to make big plays in this game, you're really going to have to be relying on that, because we saw against Michigan's defense, you got down into the red zone, and Ohio State had been one of the best touchdown scoring teams in the red zone in college football this season. Settled for field goals and had an empty trip in the red zone against Michigan. You're going up against Georgia, the number one defense in red zone efficiency in college football, because they're incredibly, you know, ruthless and physical up front, but also incredibly efficient in the system that Kirby runs on the back end. And so I think at the core of this, Georgia is just built too powerfully in the area where right now Ohio State has kind of gotten away from that Big Ten identity up front on the offensive line.